Hey everyone, this is Ian, aka Collector Emitter, and you're listening to the podcast that typically goes out to my Patreon supporters. This episode is with Lee from Leems Industries, and we talk about a lot of really interesting things, primarily expression pedals, because that's what he makes, and him kind of walking me through them and sort of selling me on the idea of expression as someone who typically doesn't use it much. And then we also talk a lot about kind of making music just for yourself or doing creative things just for yourself, not in a way of making content or trying to do something with it, and how that's really important. So yeah, it's a really great conversation just as an explanation of how this podcast works. On my Patreon, there's a podcast episode every month, and that goes out to the podcast feed for everyone who supports over there. When I have a guest, though, like this episode, I always want to post the episode onto YouTube. And so I do that delayed by 2 weeks, but also on that same day. So today, a bonus episode goes up on the Patreon feed. So in that, we talk about some of our favorite places of the internet that feel kind of like older internet, kind of pre-social media and things like that. So it was a fun conversation. That bonus podcast is always trying to be sort of focused more on what does my guest, usually a pedal builder or someone who makes demos, what do they like outside of gear and music and guitar and all that. So yeah, it's a good time. Check out the Patreon if you're interested. No need to support for more than $1. I try to keep it open to everyone. But then, as always, demos here, that's the main thing. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks. Hey everyone, and welcome to the November 2023 episode of the Collector Emitter Patreon podcast. First, I want to say sorry for the lack of episode last month and the late episode the month prior. I'm not sure if you can hear, but my voice is still a little gone, but it was more gone before, and also just back and forth with being sick. And so I was prioritizing keeping the demos going. So I appreciate your understanding with that. And now we've got a really great episode to jump right back into the flow of things. So for this episode, I'm going to be talking to Lee of Leems Industries. Lee, how are you doing?
Hi.
Yeah, so Lee, we had talked a little bit on Discord about some of the things we're going to talk about, but the first one being you make exclusively expression pedals, and I'm somewhat of an expression skeptic. So I was curious, kind of, from your side of like what draws you to expression pedals and makes them interesting, how they can interact with other pedals. Just kind of, give me the expression 101.
Okay. So, I mean, expression 101, the idea is there are lots of great pedals out there, and there have been for a long time that do really great things, and their functionality is tied to knobs, usually, or at least that's one of the primary user interface things as far as pedals go. But for a long time, there's been kind of this recognition that you might want to kind of effectively do the same thing as twisting a knob while you're in the middle of performing, and you've got your hands tied, especially if you're a guitar player, and you want to be able to effectively turn a knob, but in some other way. And the normal way to do that is to plug in a pedal that looks very much like a wah pedal that rocks back and forth, and
Right.
operate it with your foot basically. So that was kind of the standard idea of an expression pedal for a long time, and the way that I think about expression pedals and the way that I've created different devices that can act as an expression pedal. It kind of challenges that single form factor of the rocking treadle pedal, basically.
Yeah. And so you
But
Oh, go ahead.
the idea conceptually though is just any sort of external device that is changing a parameter on a pedal.
Right. So yeah, I just in my personal use, I've had the treadle expression pedal. I have the pedal brains, which is kind of a complex LFO expression pedal, and find interesting ways to make sounds with it. But I think what's it's always I think I come from like a set it and forget it, and so the more complications I can take out of the moment of finding a sound, the better. But then I look at you've got the laser proximity expression pedal, and you've got the throttle expression pedal. But the one that sticks out to me is the spring expression, where
Right.
you're kind of controlling, like, it's not exactly a randomness, but it's like your input is creating something that's not going to be just your input. And so that almost interests me or that certainly is what has kind of stuck in my head of your stuff from what I've seen. And I wonder if that's kind of maybe touching on a bit of what you had mentioned with that kind of approach or philosophy of like something that's like so out of the norm that I almost have to either not think about it or only think about it. Like it's just something I plug in and I hit, and it's like I don't know what will happen, or I'm like building everything around it so that it's kind of becoming like the deterministic piece of my setup.
Right. I can understand that. And I'm glad you used the word philosophy, because I do get kind of philosophical about it. So the kind of, I think, really interesting comparison that or an analogy that I can make is, it kind of reminds me of, do you remember like in the early 2000s when people talked about like mashups?
Yeah.
When you take, like, let's say YouTube and like Google Maps or something, and someone might take both of those services and they make some third thing that uses both of those data, but like maybe I don't know, like you have a mashup that tells you like where on the globe different songs are made or something like that. It's this idea that you've got these powerful things, and then if you do a little extra work to open them up to whoever wants to tweak them, then like you can make this third thing, or this thing that this brilliant person made, but they couldn't imagine that someone else might even take it and run with it even further. I think of that a lot when it comes to my philosophy about expression pedals, because it's like someone designed this circuit and they basically opened up a port to do things with that circuit that maybe the person who designed the circuit couldn't have imagined. And that's definitely kind of the whole idea behind Leems Industries. It's like, okay, there's this idea that you have a pedal that rocks back and forth, and that's kind of the standard way of thinking about this. But it's like, what else could it be?
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And kind of maybe that's the key to, um, me approaching it differently and thinking about expression in a way that makes sense to me is because, as I talked about it, I'm thinking like, how can I use, starting with, let's say I have a filter pedal, starting with the filter, how can I use this expression device to create the right sound or fit my the guitar part I'm playing. But that mashup analogy kind of had me thinking, how can I use the expression to almost have the filter do what it's not supposed to, or kind of create a third or kind of a half new thing out of the parts of these two that isn't just here's like a little utility to give me just that tiny bit of movement and then unplug it and move on.
Yeah, absolutely. And the best example of that is if you can express like a pitch parameter on a pedal, and this is pretty common in the synthesizer world, is that you might want to create a form of distortion that's just a high rate modulation of pitch. So if you've got a pitch pedal, we tend to think of like a pitchfork or whatever as doing a certain thing. But if you've got an expression pedal that lets you modulate that pitch so fast, or faster than that you could by rocking your foot back and forth, for example, then you've turned your pitchfork into a distortion pedal.
Right. Yeah. That's something when I have a new pedal, I always try, especially if there's an LFO, I try to see, can this go into audio rate, or, the big thing is like, can a delay, does it have a good kind of fake chorus sound? Does it get quick enough and, work well there? I always try to do that within the parameters that the pedal establishes. And then, so this is kind of like, well, what if you just throw in an extra parameter, and in that case, maybe then you could push, if let's say it was a tremolo and the LFO doesn't quite go into audio rate, but it has expression to override the LFO and could put an even faster LFO, or, something like that. Yeah, maybe this is kind of my way in of, it's just, that little extra piece to make a new thing.
Right. And I've got another possible way in for you. Um, but first I have to kind of establish your thoughts on this whole idea. So I I think of expression pedals in the way that I use them as kind of similar to uh, this very abstract idea that people talk about with tube amps. When people who really appreciate tube amps, they say like sometimes it's not even something that the audience hears, but it's more like a feeling thing, right?
Right. That's something I say pretty often. So
Okay.
I've got you so far.
And right, so it might like draw a better performance out of you, right? That's kind of the argument is like the audience would understand and respect that you made a good performance, but maybe you made that good performance because of the way your amp interacts with your playing.
Right.
Right. So that is something that I experience when I use expression pedals. So if I've got something, this other thing that I have to kind of think about while I'm playing, which I know is like the opposite of what you said, but this is my experience, is that sometimes if I've got something else, some other body part that I'm moving that's in play, it makes me think less about what my hands are doing, where my fingers are,
Right.
and it kind of snaps me out of like overthinking things. And that's not always the best thing, depending on what the situation is. But especially if you're just sort of practicing it, like is a good thing to do early on to like snap you out of overthinking things.
Yeah. I mean, that's, uh, I think, as you kind of mentioned, that is like kind of the opposite of sort of what I run into sometimes, which is that like any distraction of, just trying, like I never use wah pedals until I got the wah pedal that Flower Pedals made, because it's in a standard pedal format and can be LFO modulated or envelope modulated. And, it's like, okay, I don't have to think about the foot because it's not something I ever did. And so the kind of physicality of it starts to trip me up. But I do understand the idea there, because that's how I am with kind of everything else outside of guitar. And, always kind of looking for something where, my ideal scenario, like when I kind of feel like I'm at my best, is if I've got like these kind of the main thing I'm doing, and then this thing that can take away the kind of need to move around or think about other things and drift off. It's like, okay, I can fully focus on this because I'm kind of not mindlessly, but not actively, I'm passively doing the thing to like kind of take out the distractions, to kind of get into that almost like into the zone, kind of into the flow state type of thing.
Right. And that's one thing I use it for, but I also at the same time I appreciate your point of view where you're saying, it's kind of just not for me for this distraction reason. And that's kind of at the heart of why I'm pursuing this like laser pedal or laser expression pedal stuff, is because I want to get to a point where you could have an expression pedal that is like watching you, and you're you really can like just set it there and not think about it. And then it's sort of like your your interaction with the expression pedal at that point is like just listening to how your movements in space are affecting the sound, and not, how far your ankle, what angle your ankle has, turned to, and that kind of thing. And that's what it's all about. Because I've I honestly never owned a traditional expression pedal until after I started building some of these things, because it just never sounded like something that would work for me.
Interesting.
And I think that's kind of like what you're saying.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, even learning to kind of get that, to change the relationship and get that, like into that zone, the flow, so that the guitar can be just fully, passive is the word that is coming to my mind, but that's not exactly what I mean, or what you're saying. But yeah, that makes so much sense. And it kind of reminds me of also or I guess more in the early 2010s, but the whole controllerism movement, with MIDI instruments, and kind of, I guess it was mostly centered on electronic music, just based on the means of interaction, but where people were making gloves that sent different MIDI signals when you moved your hands. And that's, I guess, kind of most famously Imogen Heap, her whole kind of dynamic harmony generating system is with, gloves like this, that different gestures are creating different sounds. And yeah, kind of the idea that someday you could have just an expression pedal that is kind of playing with you. That's something I often find I need is, or I talked about this a bit on a couple episodes ago with Matt from Ambient Trash, the YouTube channel, where we talked about kind of being at our best as a bandmate, where we can kind of fill in other people's ideas and bounce off of the energy of other people. And maybe the expression pedal could be kind of like that collaborator that just doesn't, it's not something you need to do something about, but it's bringing, changing your sound in a way that's like, oh, well, then maybe I'll go to this chord, or, start playing in this way. And it starts to kind of create, a duet in a way.
Yeah, that's not something I'm familiar with because I haven't played in a lot of bands, but that makes perfect sense. And kind of as a more practical, I guess, riff on what you're saying is that another way to approach expression that maybe people don't think about is we've got all these advanced pedals now where you've got like an individual pedal that has an effects loop where you can put other effects into it. So if you're someone like yourself who kind of doesn't like the distraction of it, maybe put something that has an expression input in the loop so that you can mix it in, so that it's not distracting you. It's just sort of there. And it's kind of like a compromised way of using expression that where you can kind of play around with it, but it's not like you have to think about it all the time because it's kind of in the background.
Yeah, that's you've got me thinking a lot now about even just, I say we as in kind of just the pedal community talk about the right signal chain and the order of effects. And, then I always say that isn't as important as you might think, do the wrong order and see what happens, kind of thing. But, this kind of has me thinking about how the choice of that order is not just, I want this to affect this, so I'll put it later, but also how can you sort of maybe mix and match things, or like if you have multiple pedals with clean blends, the clean blend for the second pedal is going to have, the full, whatever the blend is from the pedal before it. And so you're not just stacking the order of you want those effects to happen in, but also the order you want them to be mixed together in. And so that, you're kind of nailing my weak points as a guitarist and as a pedal person, which is I also never use, very rarely do I use the effects loop in those types of pedals. So I feel like you're opening up these new worlds for me.
That's good. Yeah, and honestly, I kind of work the same way. It's like I have a very standard looking pedal board. I don't have like a ton of expression pedals on it even. They're always just sort of like reserved for these experiments and things like that. It's kind of how I approach it. I have like a very standard pedal order and everything like that. But then I always have a spot for experimentation and just like throwing things on the ground and trying things. It's definitely my approach.
Yeah, that's me as well. Kind of the consistent pedal board, and then the experimentation spot. And now I'm trying to kind of capture both in a way that that seems right, where it's consistent, but there's also room for experimentation. And you're giving me some ideas, so this is great. But we also wanted to talk about some connected things that weren't necessarily explicitly just about expression. So I don't want to, because like I said, this has kind of got my mind going to a million different places, and I could keep going on this for a while, but I want to get into some of the other stuff. So is this tied to kind of the sort of philosophy of how you approach designing these pedals that we talked about a bit already?
Yeah, definitely. So my big thing is I like to say that I advocate for dilettante musicians. And what I mean by that is I feel like in this, I don't know, in this culture or in this world of music gear, there's kind of this emphasis, and there's a certain amount of like assumptions about people who play music, and and the assumptions are like very basic. Like if you play guitar, let's say, you have goals like that you want to be in a band or that you want to play on stage.
Right.
And I like to challenge that. And even like, even from like a marketing perspective, I think a lot of companies they market in that very strict way, and they, I guess, treat people who play music for other reasons kind of differently. And I think it's an opportunity that companies could take advantage of, is kind of like recognize that there are people like that, people like me who are out there. And and I have all these thoughts about that, but something that I've heard you say multiple times has piqued my interest as like feeling like a kind of similar concept. And I would like you to hopefully explain it to me a little more, because you've mentioned it here or there, but I haven't found a very very large explanation for it. But
Right.
I've heard you say something like, don't make content for content's sake. So first, I'd like to understand that better, and kind of see if I'm right that we're kind of have some overlap in those ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. So much so that you kind of almost like nailed the sort of escalation of where that idea of don't make content for content's sake goes in my mind, which is, a lot of my thoughts on this have come from, which, like you said, I talked about this a bit on Instagram and on this podcast, and on when I was on the No Gods, No Master Volumes podcast. So some of this might be repeating myself a bit, but I started thinking about this when I got into photography as kind of a separate hobby, a creative outlet that didn't really have goals or, the need to do anything. It was just creating, and creating for myself and for the, all the ways that kind of affects my mind and, my mood and, my thought process and everything. And so, then that's kind of, I think what you're saying with, kind of more, when you were going over the, dilettante musician and kind of how you see yourself of not having these bigger goals, but just wanting to, or rather your bigger goals aren't the bigger goals of the standard assumptions of playing live, playing in a band, those types of things. And that made me think. I recently did a workshop for street photography with a photographer that I really like. And in the first session of it, where everyone was introducing themselves, I introduced myself and said kind of something along those lines. And he said something about kind of no careerism goals, just kind of enjoying the hobby. And I was like, well, it's somewhere in between, because I have no goal of, making photography my career, but it's also not, I wouldn't describe it as a hobby. It's something that I'm very much interested in and passionate about, but not so much so that I want to, kind of make it everything for me. It's something that I can kind of compartmentally be passionate about. And so how that all connects to not making content for content's sake is that has kind of helped me realize kind of my philosophy with my YouTube channel this whole time has been making videos that are kind of to the point and to my point, not kind of showing, oh, this might be a question someone asks, so I should show it. But here's what someone like me would do with this pedal. And then as making YouTube videos led into also making content for Instagram and making exclusive content for Patreon and, doing all these things, that kind of felt overwhelming, and which led to me developing the interest in photography, which led to me kind of coming up with this mindset of everything I do, even if it's, even if a builder sends me a pedal, I should only do the video if it's something that makes sense to how I would make a video. Even if I love the pedal, but it doesn't really fit into what I do and I can't figure out how to do it, then, at that point I'm just making, something that I would more describe as content as opposed to, again, talked about this in the episode with Ambient Trash, but, I wouldn't necessarily call my YouTube videos art in, kind of a full sense of like, these are, works of art, but it's not just, content to me is more like doing it because that's what you're supposed to do, or that's what, it's just sort of the routine. And so extrapolating that out onto Instagram, I used to try and post multiple, times a week, every other day or whatever it was. And then it's like, well, if I don't have anything to say, I shouldn't post, because then when I do post, then hopefully someone can see that and say, okay, I want to read what this has to say or look at whatever this is because it's something. And same with, this podcast, trying to kind of create new conversations that are not really represented in other podcasts. And, I've mentioned a couple times I'm working on a zine about pedals, which it's taking me so long because I'm trying to figure out like what's the reason this should exist, and then kind of filling it in from there, as opposed to, oh, I have that idea, let me just kind of like autofill, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And it sounds like we are very much talking about the same thing. I think they're different angles, but we're talking about the same thing. And I didn't really answer your question. So how it relates to, the Leems Industries and the company is, when I'm making these pedals, I mean, they're inherently kind of goofy a lot of times and not serious. And that's just one example of like, how this philosophy is applied. It's like I don't let um this idea always creeps in. It's like, would someone use this on a stage? Would a serious musician use this? And it's like I never let that govern how I'm gonna do things. And if that means that they won't sell, then I'm perfectly fine with that, because that was never kind of the goal of this thing. It's sort of like, in some ways, I have like the bedroom guitarist in mind when I'm designing these things, and it's just a bonus if a serious musician um, kind of likes them or sees some value in them. So that's how it kind of relates to the company, but it's also kind of like a larger thing that I try to push for, just as an attitude that I see out in the world, because we are interacting with musicians in this world, and it's like I just always try to help people realize that there are people who play music that don't have these goals, and honestly, I try to push people in any opportunity that I can who are like stifled by these attitudes and these default goals that people feel like they're supposed to have. And I'm sure you've seen people who like start playing guitar and they don't get very far and they get discouraged and they stop. Yeah. And I think a lot of times it's because they just have this default idea of what they're supposed to be doing, and it's so hard to make what they're doing look successful to themselves that they just stop. So I'm always trying to find opportunities where I can like reframe what success is for guitar, for playing music, because I've always had kind of a weird way of thinking about it. And it actually goes back to like my origin story of getting into guitar, if I could share that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I got into guitar the same way a lot of people do. Like I had a family member who had a guitar and he let me play it, and that was enough, just playing with a few times to get me hooked. And, I saved up my allowance and some birthday money or something, and I went and bought like the Squire Strat Pack that I think a lot of people start with, and I stopped and I bought it on the way to my grandparents' house. And so I had this guitar and my grandpa was there, and I was like, I don't know what he's going to think about this, but I was like, check this out, Grandpa, I got a guitar. And he's just like, I have a guitar, did you know that? And I didn't know that. Like, I had no clue. I was like 12 or something, and I'd been around my grandpa my entire life, and I didn't know he played guitar. I didn't know he owned a guitar. And it was just like this kind of very freeing idea that you can do this and it's just for yourself and it's not for anyone else. And it's almost like it's like it's his form of therapy. It's not for anyone else to see. It's not for anyone else to know about. He just like does his thing. And he eventually he passed away, and I own that guitar now. And after like researching it a little bit, it kind of like all this stuff builds on top of itself. But I learned that this was like the classic Sears acoustic guitar. It's like a Harmony or a K. It's not that, but it's basically the same thing. Right. Guitars used to be in the Sears catalog, and like I don't think there's a version of that now, or it's hard for me to point to something and be like, guitar is an acceptable hobby for anyone. It doesn't feel like that anymore. It feels like we've kind of lost that.
Yeah, I think, maybe going back 10 years, there was First Act, which you could get in a Toys R Us or something like that. But yeah, we've really kind of like, I think this is sort of where my entry into thinking about these things came from. But we've kind of got to a point where any creative outlet is something that should be like fully invested in and then monetized, because one, isn't that the dream? You get to make money playing guitar. But two, you probably need to make money playing guitar and make money elsewhere just to kind of keep everything going, and the more that's seen as normal, the more it's seen as like, oh, well, learning a skill is not a hobby. It's learning a skill that you can then, if you play guitar, you must play live, because then maybe you can make a little bit of money to cover, your guitar playing expenses. And it's, kind of warped so far to the point where it's just not really something that, I don't have any kids, and I don't know anyone with a kid who would be in the right age range where they would be getting into like wanting to play guitar. But I don't know where you would beyond, that kid being a music fan or having someone they know play guitar. I don't know where they would find that interest, because it's not something that's super prevalent, and it's not something they're going to walk by in the store. And so, yeah, then it kind of becomes a thing of you learn later, and, at that point you have these strong ideas of what you should be spending your time on. When, in my opinion, the reality is there's nothing you should spend your time on. There's things we need to spend our time on. Like I said, to keep the lights on and keep our families fed and whatnot. But there's nothing we should spend our time on. And so, it just kind of becomes a thing of, pushing further and further away from, here's just something you can enjoy, and, something you can, like you mentioned with your grandfather, that find that kind of meditative or therapeutic relationship with. It has to be productive.
Yeah. I heard, or I saw something online that is very much in line with that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was basically saying like, we shouldn't. We have a problem that we think of music as a skill, and it's like, humans make music just because, like the same way that birds sing. You would never see a bird singing and be like, he should try out to, be on the American Idol of Birds or something like that. Like he should figure out how to monetize that. It's like, no, like we just do it, or some of us do.
Right. And in a way that is like, it's not something, it's a skill. And, being able to play certain ways is, you've learned that skill, but in a way where it can't be anything else. So much so where, this is something I see a lot on comments on my videos or on social media in general, talking about pedals. But the question always comes up of, is it musical? And, the first time I saw that question, I laughed, because it's like, of course it is. It makes music. And that, not trying to be like snarky, but like even the pedals that make the worst sounds you've ever heard, or, the pedals that are kind of more like, I guess the extreme example would be like the fart pedal that is essentially just a joke. It takes your musical input and has a musical output. So no matter how you use it, it's musical. But, the question's obviously asking for something, much more strictly defined version of what music is or should be.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, that's kind of my whole thing is just making it so that people have other ways to think about music, and especially their own musical journey, because it seems like it just keeps getting more and more compressed to be like this very simplistic idea of what it is. And I think there were times in the past where there were fewer roadblocks to playing music, and like, I mean, we even see it in the form of like all the jokes and memes about someone breaking out a guitar at a party, um, how that's universally frowned upon, and stuff like that, which may be true, but I feel like there were times in the past where that was not the case. And there's also this story from history that I think of when I think of this kind of thing. And I only learned about this because it was a thing that happened geographically close to me. But I read about this group of musicians that they refer to as Dayton Funk, like the Love Roller Coaster song. I forget who that's by, the Ohio Players. Um, but basically, the idea is that there was this scene that kind of sprung out of an unlikely place in Dayton, Ohio. Um, and the people who are working on writing the history of this thing that happened, uh, they basically found that part of the reason that this was able to happen was because there was a thriving middle class in this area. There was industry that was booming, and it led to the middle class people living in this area being prosperous. And it's like that gave breathing room, whether it be free time or uh, expendable cash, having a little extra money around to buy your kid a guitar when at a different time or a different place that might have not been the case. It led to creating a supply and demand for music. So you had people who were able to kick back on the weekend and go see live music suddenly. So they're creating the demand for it. And it also kind of freed up, families to say, okay, I've got these kids, I've got to force them into, making money for the family or not. And,
Right.
maybe they can make the choice to basically patronize their children as musicians and support them a little bit. If they had an interest in music, they could come to their parents and say, I'm into this, and it wasn't immediately shut down. It was like, okay, well, we're in a pretty good spot, so we can support this. And it just created an environment where this whole, sound developed in an unlikely place. And it's all related to this same thing, I think, where if you can create an environment where, if you're fortunate enough to create an environment where things are, a little more prosperous, then, these things happen. But if everything is coming from a, scarcity mindset, or making your decisions based on scarcity, you might stifle a would-be musician and that kind of thing. And it all comes back to what we were talking about before, where it's like, if if you look at the marketing, the traditional marketing in the music gear world, they're marketing toward uh, people who are trying to make a living making music, and as we all know, that's kind of a scarcity situation. Like they're trying to grab dollars from record deals and things like that. And I mean, all that makes sense, and they've been successful in doing that. But I kind of would like to challenge that and uh, ask the people in the gear community that I can, get their attention. What if you do that type of marketing, but you also do this other type of marketing for all these people out here who are doing this like very in a very literal sense as a hobby, and they don't intend on being on stage, and they don't intend on being in a band, and they have a steady full-time job that provides for their family, and they are really playing music as kind of like a therapeutic thing. Then why wouldn't you use marketing that is similar to like a wellness company?
Right.
And because those people exist, and there are lots of people that are lucky to be in that situation. But if they look at how music gear is marketed to them, it's just sort of like, okay, well, I'm not trying to play in my church's band, and I'm not trying to go to the club downtown and play. So this is kind of missing the mark. But I'll still buy this stuff, but I don't feel like you really get me, marketing person.
Yeah, I mean, it almost makes me think of during the biggest period, the earliest period of the COVID lockdowns, where guitar sales exploded, and sales of any kind of creative equipment or anything like that were doing really well. And partially that's because people had more time, and people had the stimulus checks to those who are fortunate enough to spend on things to kind of help get through the time of things being so different. But I think just anecdotally, but also based on a report that Fender had put out, a lot of people picked up a new hobby during that period. And a lot of people, people I've spoken to, picked up something that they always kind of had an interest in, but now it's like, well, I might as well take the time to learn to do something that helps me feel better, because we were in a kind of collectively traumatic time, and we had to make ourselves feel better. And the truth is, when the COVID lockdowns ended and we went back to things as normal, we still need that kind of bit of personal meditative or therapeutic activity, because there's all kinds of things, whether it's in your personal life or in kind of just seeing things happening locally or globally or whatever it is, or even if it's just the stress of work or kind of things that you shouldn't be stressed about, but you are. We all need to have something to release some of that and to feel happy and good. So I 100% agree with you. And yeah, I do wish there was more kind of focused on that purpose of just doing something for the sake of doing it, and not much more. So my question for you, to kind of wrap things up, and it might be, kind of a lofty question. And so if the answer is, I don't know, that's a fully valid answer. But as someone who is, doesn't have these sort of traditional goals, what would you say is a way to kind of avoid that hump of feeling like, as you mentioned before, you pick up guitar, you feel like you're not making progress, you feel like maybe you should kind of throw in the towel, maybe this isn't for you. What's something that kind of helps keep some of that motivation and interest and joy there without slipping into the mindset of should I be improving or doing something with all of this?
Yeah, I've got lots of answers for that, luckily. So, a big one for me has to do with learning. So, um, when it comes, or I guess I should say, if you're not in a position where you can practice for hours and hours a day, that comes with the territory of you know music and playing guitar as being like a small part of your life and not like a career or anything close to it. So a big part of it is how you learn, because you have to think about, okay, well, you have to be realistic about, I'm not going to master music theory, let's say, for example. And you just have to admit that to yourself and say, okay, there's a limit on how much music theory I can learn. So how do I learn the most music theory that I can to, it's just about being deliberate about what you learn and thinking about how it affects your goals. So like, for example, um, like everyone else, I'm looking at YouTube videos to learn how to play guitar, and it's like I don't ever go towards something that's like a completionist sort of way of learning, and it's a big red flag for me if someone says you have to watch this other video as a prerequisite to this, because that's kind of like saying this is a system that you have to learn completely. And instead I gravitate
Right.
toward things that are like um you know uh learn learn something about music theory that is easy to visualize, like on the neck, because I know that I'm not going to be able to memorize all this stuff. So I have to lean on like the way that things visually appear to me on the neck, like as kind of a way to remember things. So like I might not learn uh, the like right way or the academic way, let's say, to know where the diatonic chords are or something like that. But I'll learn kind of like a visual way of finding them, finding those same chords that like maybe stretches along the neck in a way that would not be ergonomic, but is something that I will remember in a way that I can just grab the guitar and start on a chord and be able to
Right.
find the other diatonic chords.
Yeah.
So and there's stuff like that on YouTube. There are people who really appreciate that and like what I was saying, I think they appreciate that you're not trying to learn a complete system, but like you're trying to learn something that's pragmatic and useful immediately. That's one thing, is I really try to be careful about how I learn so that every little bit that I learn has the most bang for the buck.
I mean, even just to simplify that, it kind of sounds like just learning, having, I would like to learn, like you said, some music theory. It doesn't have to be all of it, but just a small goal of I'd like to learn something and then doing it. That kind of, it's almost like a trial and error approach of like, I'd like to try this thing, and you do it and it's like, okay, I have something that I took away from it and that I can bring into other learning, but also just that kind of being in the zone, more, meditative playing for yourself.
Yes, absolutely. And then another thing that I do is it has more to do with your setup, your physical, like the way that you set up your guitars and your amps and your pedals and things like that, is to like I have goals for if I have 5 minutes free, can I just jump in and play guitar for 5 minutes? Because like I said, I'm very busy doing other things, and guitar is not the highest priority in my life. So it's like my whole setup is based around that idea of being able to jump in and get the benefits of playing guitar for 5 minutes, because oftentimes that's all I have. So I can't have things getting in the way. There can't be like a ramp up time to it. I got to just be able to jump in. And I also play with a looper a lot. That kind of goes along with it, where you know, I I might build a loop up from scratch, and that might include drums and bass even. So my setup is such that I can go from nothing to something in 5 minutes, and that's really satisfying to me. And my setup is conducive to that.
Right.
Um, so that's another part of it, and yeah, and just in general, not getting hung up on uh, perfection. Of course, that's the biggest part of it, and a lot of times not even bothering with like playing music that other people have created, but just sort of focusing on making my own music, but it's never recorded, and um, it's never heard by anyone else. It's mostly for me, so it's just sort of like um, thinking of it in that way automatically keeps a lot of those bad thoughts of inadequacy out. That would be my answer.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And the one thing I would add, which I guess is in a way a little contradictory to what you just said of being able to write this full song or piece of music that you'll only ever hear and will never be recorded. But another way that kind of can be fulfilling is to share very directly to people and not just out into the void of kind of like, oh, I put this onto Instagram, or even I shared this on Discord and then, or on Reddit or anywhere where maybe someone will take the time to see it. Maybe they won't. But, having a friend or a group of friends or, whatever it is where you can very deliberately share, this is what I did. And, that's all it has to be. Even if what you did isn't write a song, but it's just like, oh, hey, I made this like really interesting sound. Isn't it neat? And you have someone to share that with. And so I think a lot of times, partners or people you live with is kind of the default for that, but also just something I'm now trying to do in my own life is create like a space for myself and my friends to talk about our creative interests without having it be something that we have to make or do, but just kind of a space for us to get together and say like, oh, here's what I'm working on, or I'm not working on anything, but I'm enjoying this thing and doing this thing, or I'm inspired by this thing. And so, that would be my kind of other side of the coin, but same sentiment of sort of freeing yourself from the need to kind of get likes and share out into the void, especially as social media continues to fall further and further apart. But yeah, this has been a really great conversation. And, not only some of my favorite things to think and talk about, but also you have gotten me to rethink expression a bit. So, Lee, thank you so much for being here. If you want to tell people where they can find you, your website or Instagram or anything like that, feel free.
Yeah, I'm Leems Industries on Instagram, and you can find the pedal company at leemsindustries.com.
Awesome.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a ton of fun.
Yeah, this has been great. Thanks so much.